That's right, I was thinking if you were in your paper,
Oh, good, so that's already happening.
Okay. Yeah.
I just took it. Well, do you have relevant space to this is like trying to win here. Whether it's a message of the mass, not that. Okay. I'm Michelle. I recognize your picture when they announced your position. I messed up.
okay, nice to meet you. See?
And I was thinking about you yesterday.
Oh, all right.
Activism.
No.
Okay, I'm just going
Let's do that here as well. I will basically talk around a bit, more about
Buddhist or Baha'i do kind of work. So not so specific on the paper, so pick up on whatever you want.
Well, and I was also thinking, because I was reading some other things related to myself,
Yeah.
and so then that could be one of many. Respond to your questions.
Perfect.
Yeah, and then I would read more kind of
Okay. All
So
right.
actually, there's a book out there that I just did with
Is it on the table?
Yeah.
Okay.
And it has interviews with people in Spanish.
All right.
So I'm thinking about
You were in occupying Greece over here.
in New York. Actually, in New York. I'm now based in
Yeah. Where were you? I was in Greece for 2 months with the Freedom Flotilla when we were trying to get out, 2011. So then we went to the occupation and the protests of Sintagma, more or less every day. Yeah.
Yeah, I would say more as a little bit on the big process, but then more action.
Right. Yeah. All right. Great. Yeah. I'll also give you do some publicity for Division.
Yeah, I saw it looked interesting and looked eclectic when I looked at the different articles
Yeah.
on it,
But this is attending or increasing the scope of the editorial board and everything. So the Resist Studies magazine is
no, I mean, I didn't even know
yeah, yes. More like in Sweden, I don't know, it's in I love to be here now. gathering.
Oh, really? I feel like that's hard.
My gratitude, part of it depends on what gratitude.
And you're staying yeah. I'm unfortunately going to New York. And I'm here It is. I love it. I mean, it's going on so much. You know, there was Kurdish demonstration yesterday, and the day before a discussion about race and revolt. And then there was a protest in solidarity with Kurdism. And then, I mean, it's going on. So I love it because I mean in Gothenburg you could be happy if something is happening once in a while.
That's funny.
Yeah. I mean whole Sweden is like this. But and then I found this case here. So that's a nice way to get integrated into everybody. Some people are activists, but in their case, I mean, it's just like similar like a neighborhood directly. Yeah, I live next door to the village, so it makes sense. I don't like to stay that idea. There's something we realize it's kind of obvious, but we realize when you reach
¿Vas a estar por acá? ¿Vas a estar por acá?
you're worried.
studies and stuff. Yeah. Yeah, I'll have to know. But now,
We will try to revitalize the network. Can you, making new ones? I want to make we hope that we do the first year, then when we have something that's we have to see the we would like to see we're all over the
I do have some graduate school classes.
yeah.
Soft. Exactly.
Hello, good morning, everyone. If you could begin to take your seats, please, so we can start before we fall behind in the program already. There is somebody. There's a program. Yeah, there's a. Oh, no, these two. No, it'll be Barbara's going to introduce Stella and then introduce you. Okay, sure. Could you please take your seats? It's working. Good. Você é Jaime? Oi, Jaime. Prazer, bem-vindo. Conheci mais ou menos pela foto. Você é mais bonita a pessoa. No, not me. Thank you. So welcome everyone. I'm glad to see you all here. I'm very excited. I'm Sonia Alvarez. I am here on behalf of both the Center for Latin American, Caribbean and Latino Studies and the Department of Political Science, who are co-organizers of this event. I want to welcome all of you, but most especially our guests who have come from far and near to be with us today. This, as some of you know, is the third research conference sponsored by the Tahrir Moments Research Group, which is a group that was established in 2011 that has focused on studying protests in comparative and transnational perspective. We also organized a two-panel session at the last Latin American Studies Association meetings in Chicago in May of 2014. And actually today's meeting is more centered on the Latin American experience or Latin American experiences, partly because it is largely made possible by a grant from Mellon and the Latin American Studies Association. We're delighted to be having this conference at this particular point in time when, once again, the relevance of protest is ever more clear, from Ferguson to Hong Kong, and we have found no shortage of cases to consider as this project has evolved, and expect that will continue to be so in the future. I won't say anything more than that. I want to get to the substance of our program in a moment, but I just want to thank our sponsors first. This event is supported by the Department of Political Science, the Center for Latin American, Caribbean, and Latino Studies at UMass, the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences at UMass, the College of Humanities and Fine Arts at UMass, the Gonzalo Long Institute for Latin American Studies at UT Austin, and the Horowitz Endowment, as well as Mellon Lawson. And I want to, as usual, have personal thanks to give to people who are great team players. I want to thank my co-PIs on this project, Barbara and Charlie Hale Barbara Cruikshank from UMass, Charlie Hale from UT Austin, and Michelle Goncalves who runs the show in the Department of Political Science, Gloria Bernabe Ramos and the staff at Clackles, our team of volunteers. You'll see them, and they are around to take care of your every need, but especially the every need of our invited guests. They should have introduced themselves. We have graduate student hosts designated to each of you who are here from off campus. And then most especially, once again, Barbara extended this thanks yesterday, and I will do so very emphatically again. I'd like to thank Marta Balaguer, who most of you have gotten to know intimately via email over the last several months. And Marta, would you stand up and take a bow? Okay, so now I am going to introduce my friend and colleague Barbara, who will introduce our first speakers.
Thank you, Sonia. It is my great pleasure to introduce a new member of the Tahrir Moments Research Group, and almost even better, a new member of the UMass faculty, Stellan Windhagen. And before I do that, I want to extend my appreciation and my admiration for the leadership of Sonia Alvarez. She's the sort of boss who everybody walks away smiling. She is such a delight and a pleasure to work with, and we wouldn't be here without her leadership. So Sonia Alvarez, thanks. So it is a very deep pleasure to welcome Stellan Windhagen not only here today, but to the Tahrir Moments Research Group and to a permanent position here at UMass. He is the inaugural holder of an endowed chair in the study of nonviolent direct action and civil resistance at the University of Massachusetts. We are thrilled that he is here. He is the author of no fewer than 7 co-authored books, which means he's going to be an awesome collaborator. We've got an amazing collaborator here. We're so excited, and it's so thrilling to see that on his official UMass welcome, I don't know where this was published, but it was distributed widely. One of the things that's noted is that it says, Windhagen has conducted 3 years of field research in Europe, Africa, Latin America, and Asia. He served a total of a year in prison for various peace protests involving civil disobedience. And this is the University of Massachusetts bragging about Stellan Vindhagen's prison record. Exactly. Thank you. So we couldn't be happier than to have you here. And I just want to say that Stellan is part of and a co-leader of the Resistance Studies group at the School of Global Studies at the University of Gothenburg, and he's an academic advisor for the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict in Washington, D.C. So he's very well connected and worldwide scholar of nonviolent resistance. And one of the things that he's planning to do here at UMass, which we're really excited about, is to develop a comprehensive annual report on direct nonviolent actions, similar to reports on violent conflicts and wars. So for the social scientists among us, he's creating a database that's going to be extraordinarily valuable, and we couldn't be more excited than to have your leadership here and to have that be part of the Trier Moments Research Group contribution. So we're so thrilled to have Stellan Vindhagen here, and welcome.
Thank you very much, Barbara. This generous introduction. All right, so I'm going to talk about the topic of, it's a question, is there a need for resistance studies? And I don't know, I hope I will be controversial on some points and provoke some discussion. I work within what you could say the critical theory tradition, critical of domination, yet looking for liberation and progress, hoping that it is possible. And I think that might be provocative for some. I want to take this talk a little bit personal, to tell a little bit about my story, and through that explain why I think there is a need for resistance studies. My parents thought that I would never get a job. I was touring different activist camps, police cells, and I wasn't really very ambitious at university. I had too much other things to do. But as Barbara said, I just got this amazing position as endowed chair and professor of resistance studies, where actually activism in jail was putting me ahead in the shortlist. I think that's amazing. And it surprised my parents, I can say. So why would then resistance studies be needed? Well, the starting point would of course be that we're living in a world where the structures, the techniques, the resources, and the discourses of domination and repression is expanding all over. And we have seen that happen throughout the history. So that is part of the main problem, which we know too much about. But I would like to add, which might again be, I hope, also giving some thoughts for discussion. My impression is that liberals and radicals are preoccupied with understanding power and the problems within the structure and the system we live. I think we are putting too little emphasis on the possibility for agency within contexts and structures to transform power, dominance, injustices, and repression. The strategies of social change is what I think is the moral obligation of us that are privileged enough to spend a lot of time on understanding the world. There is a pressing need for knowing that among those that are struggling within social movements around in the world. And be assured, if we are looking on it historically, there has never ever in history been so many people mobilized in social movements. particularly in the global south. We're seeing millions of people that are mobilized and trying to affect change. So, what's our contribution to that? Being very much influenced by my family background, where my grandfather was in military prison because he was letting Jews into Sweden during the Second World War, and was a trade union activist, and my father was refusing to go to the military. This upset my grandfather a lot. And both my brother and sister have been working for Mother Teresa in India. I have been growing up with an idea of a moral responsibility for what you're doing. So, at around 15 years old, I was engaged in different social movements, and my particular focus was on the European plowshares movement. I don't know how much you know about the plowshares in the United States, but we are very inspired by them. It's a non-violent direct action movement that is inspired by Gandhi and the Christian thinking of disarming. Well, it's part of some Christian traditions at least. Where people go directly into military bases and military factories using hammers and bolt cutters to actually start a disarmament from below by people destroying equipments for nuclear weapons and weapon production. We tried to start such, you could say, European liberation movement, where we as privileged were taking part in disarming the weapons that are used in domination in the world from the 1980s and onwards. We were able to put off quite a strong mobilization of people from the 80s and onwards up until the end of the 90s, but then it faded out. To our great disappointment. United Kingdom, a more, you could say, legal approach to this form of actions were evolving, which might be surprising with such type of actions, but they were acquitted in the jury trials in UK en masse, actually. It was actually difficult to get sentenced in UK when you were doing these kind of disarmament actions. I succeeded. I ended up in prison. But others, they were then being acquitted. But it didn't really lead to any real change. It led to a discussion in UK about abolishing juries because they were giving these perverse verdicts. And the nuclear weapons are still there. So with these kind of frustrations from my own activist experience, I felt an urgent need to understand more what we could do to improve our ability to affect social change. I had, like perhaps many of you, also a lot of experiences as an activist with ineffectiveness, sectarian tendencies within movements, small-scale mobilization, short-term activist participants coming and going, lack of creativity and innovations. So, despite our trainings and workshops and handbooks, even a research group of lay scholars within that movement, we were not really able to develop. We were still acting in small, temporary, scattered, uncoordinated activism. So I felt that the research was needed. And my key question was, and still is, how it is it possible to create mass disobedience among popular movements? I was interested, and I'm still interested in being of use for activists. So I entered into the PhD studies. I realized that sociology, at least in Sweden then, were afraid of normative and ethical, political oriented research. So it wasn't really a place where I could go. But we have a good tradition of peace studies, so there I could find a place where people were normatively trying to transform violent conflicts and poverty at that department in Gothenburg. But I learned with time that much of that research, also within peace studies, was mostly critical war studies and critical security studies, counting the dead bodies of wars, studying the increased weaponry that is used, but doing little when it came to what we could actually do to affect change.
Gandhi was getting more and more irrelevant within peace studies, and I felt like an archaeologist. I was studying Gandhi and was trying to find the relevance of him today. My focus on human liberation struggles was not really present at the department. I went to prison during my PhD studies, and I realized that there was a scope for doing the kind of research that I wanted to do, but that there were few others that I could collaborate with. And to my surprise, I also realized that a number of militant activists, they view my criticism of ineffectiveness of activist movement as a betrayal. And I was thrown out from several anarchist gatherings because they didn't really view me as an activist anymore, since I was talking to the bourgeois press about problems within the movements. In my work, I have found that there is a great gap between structure, agency-oriented research and those that focus more on structure, discourse, and so on. Within nonviolent action studies, which you might never heard of, it's a small field where I try to work. There's very few scholars. They're spread out in the world, and there is a lack of systematic research being done, particularly when it comes to systematic comparative studies. But it's very focused on the strategies and what we could do as activists in a way that is very little informed by critical theories, understandings of intersectionality, or the context where we are struggling. Instead, it comes out as quite universalistic, sorry for my English, advices that more looks like, you know, the 10 points that you can get in a handbook, which is frustrating. But then, with a lot of other theories where I find so much theoretical inspiration, I have been developing more growing frustration from having to look through the index, searching for the few paragraphs and the conclusions or single chapters here and there, dealing with various aspects of different techniques of resistance in different disciplines, and with lack of coherent debate and systematic research. I've been frustrated by finding that a lot of the research within, for example, gender studies is focusing very much on gender domination, but much less on the everyday resistance that is going on in families and in patriarchal contexts, trying to find techniques of how to affect change. And the same with a lot of what I found in post-colonial studies. In revolution studies, there is a lot of focus on revolution, of course, but on structures, history, and the armed struggles, and much less when it comes to what actually popular movements could do, particularly with unarmed means. I found the everyday resistance work by James Scott and others very inspiring, with its focus on peasants and subaltern studies. But there was very little when it came to the outcomes, how small individual acts transform into mass rebellions, how that actually create a change. So I found very much of my home in social movement studies. But also there, at least my impression is, to continue this rant or criticism of the fields, I find that there has been some kind of an academic development of professionalization and specialization that has left a lot of the key questions that are concerning activists far behind. And I have, like many of you, struggle with the conceptual differences that exist between all the kind of concepts we're using, where there is perhaps little of coherent debate around the differences between, for example, protests, resistance, movements, revolutions. I found it very interesting when the book Contentious Politics came, 2001, with some of the founders of social movement studies and revolution studies, Charles Tilly, Doug McAdams, Sidney Taro. They were trying to look on all of this together in a unity theory, movements, revolutions, and rebellions, and civil war, but with a very strong structural focus, not so much to say in terms of strategies for activists, and with a focus on contentious politics, there was very little on the everyday, the hidden, disguised forms of resistance. So I came to the conclusion that there is a need for resistance studies. There is a need for collecting the different concepts and approaches that are trying to understand resistance. So in Gothenburg from 2005 and onwards, we were working on developing resistance studies. I did my PhD on nonviolent resistance. I was looking on Gandhi from the view of Foucault and classical sociology, and trying to see how it was possible to understand this religiously fanatic, half-naked fakir that Churchill called him. If he's still relevant today. My conclusion was that he was probably insane in many ways, but also a genius when it came to strategies for activists. My colleague Mona Lilia, she did her PhD on everyday resistance among Cambodian women within male-dominated politics. And we collaborated, and do still, from then on. We tried to develop resistance studies with a numerous number of articles, conceptually with a theoretical framework dealing with everyday resistance, law and resistance, Foucault and resistance. And the paper I have submitted for this conference is on Foucault and resistance. I don't know if people have got access to it, but if you want, I can send it to you. From 2011, to our surprise, after several years with a zero budget, and applause from the department that thought that this was very theoretically innovative and interesting, but a suicide in terms of academics, because it was too normative, too political. In 2011, to our surprise, we got substantial research grants from the Swedish Research Council, looking on how resistance plays a role for democratization and globalization in the Middle East and in South Asia. And then we are seeing this possibility with the endowed share that I've got now as a possibility to create links academically between Amherst and Gothenburg. That's my hope, that could develop. And in that track, we are launching right now a new journal of resistance studies, where the editorial board is really already on the making. And I have with me the policy statement for you to take if you're interested, which I will put over there. So, then you might ask yourself, what is then this with resistance studies? What is it all about? Well, I would suggest it is very much an interdisciplinary focus on all forms of resistance that links sub-themes within other disciplines, mainly within studies on social movement, revolution, gender, queer, race, class, post-colonialism, and subaltern studies. With a focus on the potential and the problems for human liberation. And with a suggested definition that is very tentative, open for debate of course, that would capture resistance as being everything where we have a subaltern action that might undermine power. A subaltern action that might undermine power. That is 4 key ingredients in that definition. There is always a relation of power or dominance. You cannot talk about resistance without establishing firstly that there exists a relation of power and dominance, I think. And then you have to identify the subaltern position within that relation. And you look on the practice or the technique that people are doing that might be hidden, disguised, that might be small scale, that might be mass scale, that might be violent or might be peaceful or whatever. And fourthly, with a potential to undermine, weaken, or destabilize power, at least temporary. So a lot of debates arise from this definition and within resistance studies as it exists so far. Do you need an intention to undermine? James Scott would suggest that you need a class antagonism. If you don't have that, you don't have resistance. I would dispute that. I think one of the most powerful resistance movements going on right now is the file sharing movement. The people that are sharing programs, music, movies, whatever. I would propose, without having empirical evidence, that about 1 to 2% of them would be politically motivated. The rest, they're doing it because they love music, programs, or whatever for free. But if you look on the outcomes, it's undermining an industry that is a multi-billion industry that is getting money from their copyrights on intellectual property. So it is, in my terms, resistance. Another debate is around, does resistance have to be public? Well, I don't think it's only public. And if we want to understand the public forms, the sudden rebellions that are happening, we need to study the hidden and disguised forms, because there are links. I think we can't understand the sudden rebellions in Burma in 1988 and 2007 if you don't look on what happened before in 88 and 2007. There were ongoing resistance that were hidden because of the repression. It had to be. I think there are a lot of resistance going on that is about working slow and working bad. When people feel exploited, that they are then doing their resistance in a creative way. We academics, it doesn't work like that. We work like maniacs. Another debate is around if it's only about collective action. I don't think so. I think it can be individual as well. As when people are badly paid, they borrow things at their workplace that they bring home. And the employer will call that stealing. A fourth debate is around the political power effect, if that is necessary. I think it's enough if there is a potential of an effect. It doesn't have to be successful. It's too much to ask of resistance that it has to be successful. I think even the slave that is spitting in the soup before serving the master is doing resistance. A fifth debate is around if resistance is dealing with all kinds of domination and power, or only the kind of domination and power that we don't like. I think resistance is also about fascist resistance. It's also about how children are making resistance against their parents. It's also about types of resistance we don't like, perhaps. And then there is a debate around the role of violence and armed resistance. So there's a lot of debates here. I think that is fine. That's great. I'm not suggesting something of that we should have a unity in such as resistance studies. Instead, we should have plurality. They should be heterodox. It should be a lot of different traditions and concepts. So the definition I propose is just a starting point for a debate. But of course, as you have realized, your favorite definition of power will decide a lot. what is then resistance. If we work with Luke's 3 dimensions, it will matter a lot if you're using a first or second or third dimensional power. And if you add intersectionality to it, then you have a lot of power relations that is working similarly at the same time in any context. As will be clear from the article I have here at the conference on Foucault, the forms of resistance will differ depending on if we're talking about the sovereign power or if we're talking about the productive power of Foucault. We have different discipline systems or even different forms of biopower, as for example with the neoliberal regimes that we're living under today. That will, of course, influence what type of resistance that becomes interesting and relevant. What would be possible if we develop such a resistance studies? Well, I think we would have more of theoretical development, contextual understandings, and dynamics where we would understand the dynamics between power and resistance. And we would have a possibility of more systematic, both quantitative and qualitative comparisons between resistance. And here comes maybe, which might provoke some people, I think we could develop something similar to medicine or military research, but with a very different focus. Empirically driven and contextually adopted technique development for human liberation, where we could learn what kind of techniques are working in what kind of contexts, where we could actually have something to say when activists are asking us, what should we do today when ISIS is threatening the Kurdish people? What should we do in Syria today? And I think we should have an answer. We should have something to say. And we should have something else to say than what Obama is saying, to invade yet another country and bomb and try to create democracy from 5,000 meters and bombing people into, I don't know what, respect of liberal values. But we have to avoid not just being problem solving within existing discourses and within the political, economic, and cultural system relations that we find ourselves. We have to be both problem solving and system critical thinking. So I propose a number of research questions that could guide these kind of resistance studies, 5 of them. Firstly, what circumstances make the negotiation of power possible? Secondly, how may power be negotiated? Using which means, strategies, and practices? Thirdly, in what situations or circumstances do the negotiations of the resistance have any impact, and what kind of impact? Fourthly, when do movements and actions of resistance in itself contribute to new relations of power? Fifthly, what is the relationship between power, social change, and resistance? If this is going to be possible, we have to create the conditions for it. And I think we need to collaborate across a lot of disciplines. We have to look on different academic traditions, focusing on understanding variations of how agency, social change, and domination could be linked. But we also need to do a second thing, which is controversial in Sweden, which I'm realizing is not as controversial here, and that is collaborations between academics and the practitioners, the activists. We have to establish that. There's a lot of reflection going on among activists. There's a lot of experience, systematic build-up among activists where the innovations are happening, where we need to collaborate. And we need to create journals, meeting spaces, joint publications, conferences, and research projects in collaborations between these academics and these activists. And then I think we are on way doing something. Lastly, what are the challenges that we're facing here then, if we would create resistance studies? We have a very specific area, but a very broad area with many disciplines and a few specialized researchers. That's a challenge in itself. But I think there is also the challenge of trying to avoid master frames or paradigms that serve certain power interests, as we can learn from medicine and military research, how they have served those with the power and the money. We need to study both the possibilities and the problems of all kinds of resistance, which means that we as resistance researchers will not always be popular among activists. We will sometimes point out the weaknesses, the ineffectiveness, the sectarian tendencies, the production of new power. So, lastly, I want to say that the challenge is how to study without serving the repressive forces and the domination, and instead contribute to increased human liberation in solidarity with the subalterns. Thank you.
Thank you, Stellan. Marina Citrine is going to offer some comments on Stellan's talk, and then we'll open it up for questions.
Okay, so I don't know if this is working. If I do it from here, we're not recording, it's fine. Can everybody hear me though? Is that? No, turn on. Okay, so all of my little things here. Sorry. I'm only responding for say 5 or 7 minutes. And just to say that I have been working, I mean, this was great and so thought-provoking, and now I have so many notes, so what to respond to. But what I've been working on are the new global movements post-2010, looking particularly at Greece and Spain, Portugal, Brazil, some of the common forms of organization, the horizontal forms, the directly democratic forms, and alternative forms of power, and then also Latin America over the last 20 years. So kind of seeing that as part of a very similar continuum of new forms of organization. So that's going to be my comments are kind of grounded in that. And starting with the intentionality, I think that's really important in this. Do you need the intentionality to undermine? I really like that, and maybe we can talk about that more over the next 2 days, because particularly in the newer movements, I think that's really true, that so many people who are organizing, you know, whether the slogan is real democracy, but it's coming from the they don't represent us. It's not let's organize a new democratic or directly democratic movement, but rather we're not being represented, we have to look to one another. So there's not the same intentionality of let's construct alternative democracy, at least in the beginning. And I think that's also true with the question of power in the movements, where, again, say in Greece, having had 5 general strikes and being completely ignored, you know, protesting against austerity, or the movements in Spain and in Portugal and all over the world. In Brazil, I'm looking, as we have friends here from Brazil, with the movements around free fare and saying, you know, we protest this, we're against this, and being completely ignored. So feeling, you know, we're talking about millions of people around the world feeling that the state has really turned their back on them. And so people then turn to one another to figure out what to do and create alternatives. So there isn't that intentionality, and that links to, and I share your critique of the contentious politics framework. And if that's something we can delve into as well a little bit in the next 2 days, because it necessitates a relationship, not just a relationship, it necessitates that your point of reference is institutions of power, whether that's the state or banks. And the new movements are not looking to those institutions to make change. Again, not necessarily ideologically. It's not because they are against the state or against the bank, or at least not at first. But because those institutions aren't solving their needs. So people are looking to one another, and examples range from, you know, the massive housing movement that I think people know about that's all over the world, the Plataforma in Spain that has 260 groups, you know, people who are affected by the mortgage crisis, part of what sparked the economic crisis, 2008, and neighbors who look to one another and form assemblies and then defend one another and defend the house. So it's not let's go protest and ask to not be evicted, it's we are together going to keep people housed. And that is seen again and again. I mean, that's throughout the world now. In the US, people may or may not know how much that's taking place in Minnesota and Chicago. People have been taking over abandoned homes and moving in homeless families. So again, that point of reference is actually one another to make that change. So I think that's really important when we're thinking about contentious politics. It's what are we contending, and to whom and where are we looking? Which then problematizes the language of protest and maybe resistance. This is something I'd like to engage more, because resistance so often feels like, okay, we're resisting X, rather than we're creating this, and we don't want you to get in our way, you being whatever institution of power that is. So how do we, without changing all of the language that's existed, how do we explain what's been taking place? There's so many examples I would love to go into as far as those people looking to one another. One little one, they're all over the world around electricity and housing, healthcare. But in Detroit, I don't know if people know, I'm kind of bringing it to a US, they've cut off, there's 300,000 people listed to have their water shut off for non-payment. We're talking $125. That started in August. And there was a traditional movement that would have fit the Tilly, Thoreau, McAdam, protest movement definitions. But then what also has come up, and I think inspired by or kind of coming out of the DNA of the Occupy movements, is people who are refusing to let the water be shut off. So they're rigging tanks, they're chasing water trucks out of neighborhoods when they come in. It's that we're going to do it ourselves and with one another. And that's they're seeing around the world, and that goes back in Latin America. I know you've done work with the MST in Brazil, or on the MST in Brazil, with and on. And that is that same idea. We're going to take over land, we're going to create new worlds in this space, and then we're going to deal with institutions of power, I think. So really briefly then on, I think the personal is really important, because so many of us do consider ourselves activists and scholars, and where do those two meet, and being useful to act, or telling, which is really hard, and then how that, even if there's a disagreement, but still feeling if we're trying to be useful, how are we then accountable? And do we need to be accountable? And I think a lot of us struggle with this, and that's something that's kind of in the room always in what we're doing. And then the danger when we're not accountable, going to this professionalization, which is where I think, unfortunately, where we ended up with social movement studies. And then the question on real change and undermining power, and this is more, I guess, a question, because on the one hand, you're talking about undermining power, and I absolutely agree, and I think that's what people in the movements are attempting to do. On the other hand, I also know you've been writing about the need to take on the structures, and not just create the kind of alternative from below here and move horizontally, but what about these structures and institutions of power? So how do those two things meet, or where do they meet? Are we creating, entire alternative societies, and then what about the institutions of power? And this is something that comes up again and again in the new movements as well, is, okay, so how do we negotiate the state? How do we deal with the state when we don't want to have anything to do with it, but what it has is ours? This is kind of what people movements are saying. So how do we help think about that using these different questions and frameworks of power? And that was easily 5 or 7 minutes. So, yeah. So now I think we open it up for a kind of conversation, discussion as a whole. Yeah? So do you want us to help facilitate? Sure. Okay. So we're going to do kind of questions, comments. Should we cluster them? Take like 3 at a time? Want me to go back up here?
Yeah, we can.
Should we? Well, how about technology? We can do the people's mic. I think we should cluster questions. So maybe take 3 questions at a time, since we only have another, say, 15 minutes for the discussion. And then with the eye and the mind of this will continue later into today and into tomorrow, like that. Okay. Go ahead.
I would just love to hear more of your thoughts and other people's thoughts about the last question that you just rose. How do the two meet between contention and resistance? Where are the intersections, and what are people thinking about that in movements and in academics?
And then 2 and then 3. And can people say their names maybe when they just...
I'm Michelle Wenderlich. I'm a grad student at Clark University in geography.
I'm Zakia Salim. I'm a professor of sociology and women's studies at Rutgers University. And I've got 2 very quick questions, and probably just as a means of clarification. The notion of resistance that comprises almost every aspect of our life, our daily life. I'm a little worried that we could get into it everything could be considered as resistance. one example you gave at the end is ISIS as being the evil, but ISIS could also be considered resistance. So how do we deal with this? And I was very happy to hear you say that it depends on your definition of power. So resistance would depend on what kind of, how do you define power? But I think it's much more complicated if we start to consider the way in which, for example, Christian evangelical Christianity in the US could be also considered resistance. And the same could be said about Hindu fundamentalism. It's also resistance. So how do we then how do we deal with it as people who are taking a radical stand on contentious movements and on resistance? The second question is about this: how do we as activists speak to activists without offending them? But that, to me, is based on a binary of activism / scholarship, which some of us can never, do, because we are actually our scholarship is embedded in political views and in probably the trajectory of activism. So these are just two things that I would like to hear your thoughts about.
So we'll just take one more and then we'll do another round after that.
Yeah, my question goes in this direction. So my question is, I don't know if it's fair to me, but I have been Jaime, I'm Jaime from Brazil. My question is about, did we give up from the great narrative, like socialism or, did we, because I feel like most of our conversations on resistance is very focused on everyday act of resistance. And it seems to be part of the difficulty to articulate a broad political project in face of all these challenges that we face in consider the specificity of different groups. So did we give up from this so-called great narratives? Is there a way to articulate this everyday resistance with a broad political project? Or is Marxism, for example, dead?
Before you respond to the three questions, I'm wondering, and this is just an organizational question, but the questions are so fabulous and they really will help us in thinking in the next 2 days. Are we recording them in some way? I mean, is there some way that we can actually see the questions as we go over the next day or two? Or if somebody could take notes now, maybe we could even put them up so we can actually see, to think in questions together over the next. So it's just a suggestion that I'm trying.
This is being filmed.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. All right. Obviously, I don't have the answers to these kind of things. I'm struggling like you on these matters. Firstly, on what you mentioned, Marina, when it comes to resistance against this and creating that, to me, the most interesting, innovative, and creative forms of resistance are those that try to combine these trends. That's why I'm very inspired by the MST, the Landes movement in Brazil, that when they occupy land in one of the countries in the world with the most unjust distribution of land, they don't only occupy the land, but they also try to create the new Brazil on that land. So the creation of a different development with ecological farming and cooperatives and all that is the means of the struggle against the unjust land distribution. And that form of constructive resistance I find particularly interesting. When it comes to how our struggles within creating a horizontal development of resistance cultures or movements and how that links to the structures of power, I think we have to take into account that there is numerous battles going on all the time, but one of the real problems, I think, is that the relations of dominance is so pervasive, is so strong, that we are still lacking incredibly behind when it comes to creating the solidarity networks and the level of mobilizations that are needed. So I think there's a need for much more development of the resistance in order to actually be able to take on the incredible forces which are embedded within imperialism and capitalism in the world that we're living in today. Yes, we have to work on how that links up to the structures of power. We have to find that out. I think we have to research on that, perhaps. Yeah, everything could be resistance, sure. But that doesn't mean that everything is interesting. That doesn't mean that everything is contributing to human liberation. And my focus is then that I want to have an open definition that makes us perceptive to innovations and new forms. But we could then in our research focus on that we believe has a potential for human liberation. And for me, that would be to focus on unarmed resistance among popular movements that are striving for democracy or something like that. But it's an open question, what kind of resistance that contributes to what? I think on the one hand, we have to recognize that there exists resistance of all kinds and political flavors and whatever that might have similar dynamics. But on the other hand, what kind of resistance do we want to support, contribute to, strengthen, and so on, be embedded within? And I consider myself very much, at least trying to be embedded within activist movements. I think it's always a struggle, always not so easy, because you get this kind of schizophrenia of sometimes being very critical in the same groups as you are committed yourself. So we need to have an ongoing discussion about that, what it means, what role we play. I mean, it's an old debate with the organic intellectuals or whatever we want to call it, professors of the street and professors of the university. Great narratives. Yeah, that's a great idea, but I think we have to recognize that a part of the problem why the left or liberals or whatever we want to call it, I mean in Europe we don't call it liberals. Liberals are part of the the problem, but I know in the United States it's maybe liberals. A part of the problem with the left is that we have historically been subscribing to narratives that turned out to be totalitarian, that turned out to be part of creating new forms of domination. And I think that what's been going on in the World Social Forum in trying to formulate a new kind of left approach, which is recognizing plurality, diversity, heterogeneity within the movements, where different kind of intersections of struggles are connecting, is very promising. But the whole work in developing new narratives and visions are incredibly important, but we have to find ways of doing that where we avoid telling what is the correct political way of being, where there is respect for difference. And to me at least, the everyday resistance is incredibly inspiring. I don't find it opposite to the great narratives, really. I find it very promising that all of us are somehow involved in being activists, because we encounter exploitation, domination in our families, at the workplaces, in our neighborhoods. And people are reacting in all kinds of small ways and big ways. Some are organized in what is called a movement. Some are expressing that politically, but people are reacting to being exploited. And that's going on all the time. And I think we need to kind of understand and connect to that. Otherwise, it becomes impossible to understand why do people sometimes raise up in massive rebellions and sometimes not. And to me, at least, potentially, the answer lays in understanding the development of everyday resistance, which create a fertile ground, a resistance culture from where something evolves. Sorry for this long answer.
That's great. Our question is, so because we started late, we really do still only have about 6 minutes left. I wonder, should we go over?
We don't have 6 minutes.
We should wrap up.
Yes.
Should we allow the questions to come out, or should we wrap up? Because there are a few
We're gonna
hands.
take one more question. It's just that we
Right.
do need
Yeah,
to move
okay.
on. And
I was
we
thinking
have
without
all
a
day for
response.
questions.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
unrelated
without
themes will come up repeatedly.
So could people just be, the two hands be very, very brief, and there's not going to be a response to it, we're just going to put the question out there. So, yeah, okay.
Hi, I have a question to you, which is a provocation, and it's not my own idea. It comes from an old feminist, Jenny Mansbridge. And she's been very interested in resistance theories over many years. And her question is, there's so much good theories about how to resist, that's her view, but there's so little on how resistance can be efficient at the global level. So you mentioned the World Social Forum, but it's not the most efficient way to connect the local with the global. When you think about Occupy and how it didn't really get somewhere, so how can resistance studies consider that question of efficiency?
And there was one more hand here. I'm sorry. And okay. Go ahead, and then we're going to.
Yeah, my question is on the distinction you made between unarmed movements and armed movements, the principle of non-violence and so on. One thing is especially referring to Gandhi. For him, non-violence was an ethical principle. So he basically believed that only if you have good means, you can have a good end. So what do these contemporary non-violent movements, do they abide by the same principle, or do they just use non-violence as a strategy? And very often there's a very fine line between like defense and attack, right? Especially if you look at suicide bombing in the case of Palestine. How can you describe it?
Yes. Two other.
Oh, do you want to take the last
Jeff, just to put them on the table.
Okay. Right. Yeah, Jeff, and there was a.
So Jeff and Northeast. I'll just be really quick. I'm interested to hear you talk more about your understanding of liberation. I think you have a pretty sophisticated view of resistance and power, and acts of resistance are always creating power and therefore exclusions and dominations, right? So if that's the case, what could liberation possibly look like?
It's more of a comment. I don't see much of how can the resistance term be used, like for all kind of resistance be like a useful thing. I just think that resistance has to mean the resistance to power, and that is how connect like the theories from power to resistance. When my parents are not accepting my sexual orientation, I'm doing like everyday resistance. They are doing heteronormative. They're not doing resistance. Or maybe, do you understand it? If we use that, is it like for like in a broader way? The term loses strength.
Thank you. I'm sorry.
you.
Yes,
That's
I
great.
wish to continue. We will continue. Senator, hold your question. Don't go away.
We have the impossibility of 5 speakers and 2 commentators in 2 hours. Questions out on the table, and I think we will see those questions threading their way through the afternoon. This is a very rich panel. We will be talking about times of protest as well as complexities of locating and describing resistance and its effects in various locations. We'll be starting with Michal Osterweil from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill.
Hi, so I'm trying to keep to time. Thank you so much for having me. I'm going to not be as polite as usual because he's going to be ruthless, he told us. So my title is up here, From Movements to Moments, Taking Other Worlds and Other Temporalities Seriously. The texts up here are really just to help, because I'm going to be talking a lot, and I want some things for you to just be able to read. So, we are a movement. This is not a moment. A movement, not a moment, was one of the repeated mantras of the Forward Together Moral Mondays movement that brought North Carolina to the world attention as a site where the right wing had taken over both legislative houses and the governorship, was cutting social programs and spending at record speed, and where tens of thousands of people were taking to the streets in opposition. You might have heard of it. Reverend Barber, who is the president of the state's NAACP and the movement's self-appointed leader and spokesperson, repeated this phrase, "We are a movement, this is not a moment," often in his rousing sermon-like speeches. But for me, Reverend Barber's insistence that this was a movement, not a moment, seemed to be an almost direct response to the short-lived visibility of Occupy Wall Street and other protest movements that had turned the names of many of the world's city squares into shorthand for uprising. In this, his rejection of the positivity in the temporal register of momentness posed a striking contrast with the hope for a Tahrir moment declared by Adbusters in their July 2011 article, a hope I think that was intentional and that I believe is shared in many ways by this research convocation. So the question becomes why? At first glance, his opposition makes perfect sense. Who wouldn't rather be a movement than a moment? Movements are big, they endure, they are world-changing. Moments are, well, they're moments. They're brief, episodic, temporary, fleeting. This implies that they do not last, they do not endure, or they do not, it would seem, build lasting change. And not surprisingly, according to many standards of measure, many from contentious politics, and we won't get into that now, can probably be considered a more successful social change project. But there's something here precisely in this temporal difference, the normative favor we tend to pay to the bigger, to the more enduring movements, that I believe can help us lend clarity to the first set of questions unifying this research project. Questions that for me have everything to do with how we understand, and often, perhaps more often, misunderstand, the political and ontological natures of many contemporary social movements. So most of us are right now familiar with dismissals of Occupy Wall Street for failing, we just heard one, being fleeting, being ineffectual. Such criticisms are perhaps best captured in statements like, "It will be an asterisk in the history books if it gets a mention at all." Both during its heyday and since its displacement from Zuccotti Park, OWS has been decried for failing to achieve substantial change or having any real political impact. Like the global justice movement before it, Occupy was criticized for many of the qualities participants in OWS seemed so proud of. Its lack of clear demands, its heterogeneous constituents, its prioritization of form, horizontality, assemblies, working groups, and deliberately avoiding clear demands over content. Its refusal of leaders, wariness of electoral politics, and its emphasis on play, performance, and fun. In fact, many critics have said, it's all play and no power. These criticisms become all the more fascinating given that not long before all of these declarations of failure, journalists, researchers, and activists alike were buzzing with excitement about the return of social movements, the recommencement of history. So you might remember that Time magazine named the Protester Person of the Year when they wrote, protesters in 2011 didn't just voice their complaints, they changed the world, hearkening back to the period before the end of history, they actually write this, when protesters were prime makers of history. So it's interesting, how did these movements change the world and become an asterisk in the history books in such a short time span? And this was not the first time I had watched a protest movement captivate people's imagination, serve as a moment after which nothing could be the same, and then, within a few years, sometimes even less, be considered negligible. So my goal in this paper, which is a much shorter paper than what I already did, which is already part of a larger book project, so we'll see how it goes, is to argue that the discussions of winning and losing, success and failure, characterizing current assessments of, debates about, and strategy discussions for movements, both from critics and participants, are not getting us very far. They are themselves missing out precisely because they fail to realize that these opposing pairs, win-lose, fail-succeed, and others, are part of an epistemic culture and political ontology dominated by dualisms, a one-world view of political possibility, and a linear temporality. So, saying this differently, the argument I want to make here is that a large part of the reason that movements like Occupy, Seattle, Tahrir, etc. are appreciated, lauded, proclaimed to be world-changing at one instance, and then shortly thereafter become illegible, invisible, declared failed, at times by the same people that celebrated them, has to do with the fact that we are failing to register the planes of reality, including, importantly, the distinct temporalities at which they are working. So this, in turn, and this speaks to our relationship to movement, requires recognizing that the interpretive frameworks used by activists and analysts alike are themselves involved in whether or not these movements' true effects are registered, and therefore whether their achievements happen, whether they're seen. In this, I believe we must recognize that even many of us who are intellectually committed to or believe in what I'll get into in the notion of ontological multiplicity often fail to really take these other worlds, these other ontologies seriously. So in what follows, I'm going to pick up on a few points in my larger paper, and to do this I'm going to begin by more fully articulating this political problem of interpretation as I see it, a problem I'll talk about as the problem of political realism. I then go on to argue that we must reframe our understandings of these movements as a matter of ontological politics and difference, in which affectivity is understood at a more micro-political and molecular level. Okay. So this is the second part, taking other worlds seriously and the problem of political realism. This paper is in part a response to this problem of political realism. And by political realism, I mean a few things. First, the tendency to always opt for the more strategic, expedient, credible option. That is, voting for a candidate you don't believe in, because the more radical option is unrealistic. It is unwinnable. Or perhaps less obvious, the argument that one needs to support a campaign at the level of the UN to set 1.5 degrees as the maximum, rather than participating in direct actions or working to shift cultural understandings, because these are just symbolic and have no real chance of making a real difference. Second, and closely related, is the assumption that certain sites of politics are more real than others. All of these tend to also depend on the idea of the effect or impact as visible, if not measurable. Well, I am empathizing with the concerns that have called, and part of this comes from my watching starting around 2009 with the COP15 events in the Conference of Parties in Copenhagen. Throughout the event and the months surrounding the climate summit, I kept hearing statements like the ultra-globalization movement had failed. We had been wrong. And it was a we. The cycle of struggle was over. We had been wrong because of our prioritizing of form over content and all the things that I was mentioning earlier. Moreover, people actually use the language of we need to get real. We need to become a more unified, strategic, and massive social movement for something clear. The implicit suggestion was the ultra-globalization movement hadn't been. That is, that it had not been for something, and that maybe it had not been real. Practically, this meant abandoning many of the signature components and methods that many of us have talked about as the hallmarks of this ultra-globalization movement. So while I empathize with these concerns, especially compelled by the sense of urgency climate change and various crises pose for us, this turn to what I call political realism is very concerning. Not only because I believe it's empirically wrong, but also because it is precisely in this diagnosis that we are failing to understand the register, or the way that these movements had and continue to work and succeed without using the failed biodualism. So obviously I already talked about how we heard very similar arguments about the Occupy movement. And more recently I listened to a speech by one of the spokespersons for Podemos in Spain, speaking of the success of Podemos and suggesting that if anything were to be learned from the recent movements, it was the importance of abandoning the autonomist, change the world without taking power visions of social movements in favor of a more traditional political formation that could win elections. Now, I actually don't want to comment on Podemos. I think it's a very interesting political articulation in Spain. I'm more interested in the way it's being narrated. So, in fact, the same person in a semi-private conversation also explained to me that the Zapatistas were evidence of this failure. They had failed because of their choice to not support López Obrador and because they had remained small, local, and limited to Chiapas. My mouth dropped internally. Seriously, the Zapatistas had failed? So one of the reasons such false assessments are being made is because many of these calls for getting more politically realistic are premised on a false trade-off between realism, a combination of naive positivism, and what many of these critics are calling micropolitics. The latter, so micropolitics, is being wrongly differentiated from real politics and seen as not real, and then treated as less significant than traditional macropolitical sites. The opposition is problematic for a number of reasons, and I'm not going to give a lecture on Deleuze, but fundamentally because it fails to recognize that micropolitics are very real, and that they in fact offer and are premised on an expanded version of reality rather than a reduced one. So micropolitics is not seeking to replace macropolitics, but it is seeking to work without the limited political foci of, yeah. So the question of realism or realisticness is not unique to climate change. I've already gone over that. And I really do get why people make these. It's why people told me to vote for not vote for Nader, why I did vote for Obama twice. But what I want to say is that we have to recognize that at some level this is a self-fulfilling prophecy, and that we might be falling prey to what Pignard and Stengers refer to as infernal alternatives. These are what capitalism and modernity actually thrive on. If, in the last instance, the dominant terrain of the political is seen as the only one that counts, we will never substantiate or innervate the fabric of other possible outcomes or reals. So I'm not saying that we should categorically avoid the state or the more tangible and visible, but I'm just saying that we have to not reduce the site of politics to these. So to address this, we need to reframe the question first by explaining that what is at stake in these recent movements is not a political failure, but rather a failure to understand the true register at which these politics are working, a level or matter of different realities or ontologies coming up against the limits of the other, or a matter of what a colleague calls ontological conflict. And, So according to Mario Blasser, and this is the next part of the paper, the present moment can be fruitfully understood as marked by increasingly visible and generalized ontological conflicts that are associated with the struggle to shape the global age as an alternative to, rather than a continuation of modernity. Ontological conflicts are central to the times because they reveal the alternatives to modernity do exist, and because they force modernity to reshape itself in order to deal with radical difference. So ontological conflicts are in large part triggered by forcefully making other ontologies fit into modernity's categories. So while many continue to explain the alter-globalization movement and perhaps Occupy as being opposed to neoliberalism and corporate capitalism, I think a more complete understanding of their actions must recognize that they are involved in a critique of or conflict with modernity, or what we can call with Escobar liberal capitalist modernity. There's a lot more to say about this, and if I have time, I'll talk about how Mario defines the modern ontology. But I want to just talk about the implications, because recognizing the ontological dimension of these politics has profound implications. Here, it's useful to, you kind of have the whole thing up there. It's useful to consider this definition of ontology. Any way of understanding the world makes assumptions about what kinds of things do or can exist, and what might be their conditions of existence, relations of dependency. You can read it. So the political implications of recognizing that our own ontology determines what kinds of entities can and do exist are substantial, because what happens when we start to recognize that the things that exist for us politically, states, citizens, corporations, movements, NGOs, those things that can exist in our own ontology are not natural, universal, or immutable. In mainstream social movement studies, movements are conceived as political givens, neutral and expected parts of any modern political order. They can't call that political order or the notion of reality implicit in it into question. So this also has tremendous consequences for how we understand change, politics, political outcomes, emancipation. And in fact, returning to the question I set out with, it's precisely the failure to recognize that what is at stake takes place and requires living up to an expanded understanding of reality and realism, where different textures, and I just want you to, this notion of textures and consistencies, compose real entities that I believe many of our misunderstandings of the potential and power of the Tahrir moments lie. So when we start to realize that we are speaking at this register, we must also realize that this is not simply a battle taking place on a terrain and topography we already understand, a terrain filled with familiar actors. Rather, what we are dealing with is our different worlds and entities actually fighting to exist, both ontologically and conceptually. So where we are faced with a political terrain potentially comprised of different kinds of assemblages, intensities, flows, forces. And while states and all of the other entities we are used to dealing with will certainly be there, the success or victory of these other politics don't necessarily register at that. They might register at a different strata and involve other entities that we don't yet have, and this is referring to another part of the paper, the glasses to see or name. In this view, political outcomes themselves look very different. They don't necessarily follow linear models of cause and effect, and they are likely to unfold according to very different temporalities. So there's a lot more, but I'm going to just end there. And I know it's hopefully a provocative paper and speaks to a lot of the things, so hopefully we can pick up that stuff. And I apologize for it being so theoretical and not empirical, but time is very limited.
Thank you, Michal. We'll now have Paul Amar from the University of California, Santa Barbara, and he'll be speaking about the street, the sponge, and the ultra in Egypt.
Okay. Yes. All right, so I'm thrilled to be here at a Tahrir Moment gathering. Very excited. I am glad that we get to have a round-the-world conversation on this panel, and that I have my favorite partner in crime here, Zakia, to represent the Middle East in the house for this presentation. So yeah, I gotta move on, plunge right in. Today, as you know, the Nobel Peace Prize was announced to Malala Yousafzai and to Kailash Satyarthi for their activism around children's rights and children's empowerment. Malala, of course, was an activist on her own since the age of 10, and they attempted to assassinate her for her activism at the age of 13. So she is a very good example of exactly what I'm going to be talking about, and it transitions very well from the last paper, because this is all about basically after someone who lived in Egypt for most of the period between 2011 and 2013, and who's constantly been back and forth to Brazil, where I also work and do research during the protests of 2013, 2014. I've been also interested in what is illegible about other kinds of protests and other kinds of spaces, other kinds of, maybe not even protest actors, but resistance actors that maybe actually cause more change, or at least cause more state response than those visible in Tahrir Square, than those seen as anarchist or as Occupy tactic resistance actors that were hyper-visibilized by the media. And I want to look at other actors that fit into larger meta-narratives circulating transcontinentally about change and resistance. So one of those that didn't appear in my book, The Security Archipelago, which is on Brazil and Egypt, militarization and resistance around securitization regimes, but was constantly, literally occupying my lobby, stopping me from getting to Tahrir Square, constantly stopping the metro and interrupting other social movements in Egypt during the period I was there, and has, of course, many, many times been a part of Brazilian street politics in the 3 or 4 years I lived in Brazil, were mass children's movements or mass children's occupations and public presence in spaces that I'm trying now to deal with in ways that interrogate these illegibilities of these forms of infantile political sovereignty as they challenge logics of authoritarian securitization. I'll try to highlight some of the key points in the few minutes I have here. First, what I'm trying to do is provide an alternative counter-reading to the readings of youth and the generational dimension of many of the uprisings around the Arab Spring, and then bringing this transnationally eventually also to look at movements recently amongst children and in the United States and in Brazil. But of course we know that for that brief moment in which there was a kind of global consensus that we're going to celebrate the Arab Spring, from the left to the right, to everyone in between, right? They were focusing on the youth. Youth being 20s to 30-somethings years old. At this point, I was the chair of the board of the youth initiative for the Open Society Foundation. So me, 45 years old, I was like Mr. Youth. So, youth was the thing. And youth was kind of anybody who could kind of rock and roll in the streets. And, it was but it was not children. It was university age plus. They were specifically tied to a particular liberal imagination of a certain notion of diversity, but that wasn't grounded in meta-narratives of class. It was grounded in micro-narratives of personal, entrepreneurial, creative sociabilities, creative and even anarchic sociabilities, but not meta-structures of class or even of generation, really. It wasn't like 1968 in the same way, for example. It was about individual creativity, sociabilities, and new high-tech. And it was very much mirroring discourse in which we are them, they are us. You can take a person from Oakland wearing a face covering protesting police and blur her on the cover of another Time cover so that it almost looked like a woman wearing a hijab in Cairo protesting. It was a mirroring discourse in which the differences between these protest movements were blurred, but in which it was safe to celebrate because they were youth, not children, not those adults in the crony apparatuses of the state. They were individuals working on new media, which our global economy, meaning the United States global economy, could champion as a vehicle out of the recession, etc. And the target was to protest a dictator rather than to protest the system itself. This is the way it's represented in discourse. Again, it's rather still illegible what actually was the generational or the kind of age groupings and the values of those most radical elements in some of these movements on the ground. So what I wanted to look that then rose in 2013 and now more in 2014, another model about young people, now younger people, as in a sense the absolute opposite of what their older brothers and sisters represented 2 years ago. And this has become the new model of the failed future, of the quote-unquote failed revolutions of the protest era in South America and of the Arab Spring era in the Middle East. So you have a Guardian cover photo of a Yemeni child protester, but representing, again, this kind of loose children and the lost hope of the future in the Arab Spring models. You have, within discourse itself, within the Arab world, you have a return to an obsession with loose children, with lost generation, with street children, with rampaging, images of rampaging, criminalized children, who again kind of become, in this perverse way, the opposite of what then their idealized older brothers and sisters represented. Now these are both, I'm talking about representations here, and I want to go beyond that to talking about the political economies and the particular sociabilities of children as real actors, and how in fact they always were and continue to be actually in some ways much more interesting than their slightly older brothers and sisters that I was so engaged with during the youth moment of 2011 and 12. So youth today, children, not youth, children meaning somewhere from age 8 to 18. Of course, all these things are very subjective, but we're meaning not university age agents in public have become, for reasons which I continue to think about over the last just year or so, constantly the theme of the most monstrous political, militarized police and security attacks across the world. We've had this, of course, the crisis over immigration, the kind of racial crisis of a few months ago, driven by children who were migrating themselves, who were moving to threaten the U.S. border, and you had Governor of Texas with his big phallic weapons pointed basically at small children, and this discourse of the child then as placing themselves at the border as both an attack and a defense. You have this happen during, of course, the war on Gaza, in which you had this obsession with children placing themselves as human shields, so therefore they could become legitimate targets, not just exceptional targets, but primary targets in both the representation and the real casualties of this war. So it's extraordinary, but this so we can imagine, okay, this is a perverse shift in racial militarized politics of a current moment, or we can, perhaps for provocation or perhaps for real reasons, look back a couple of years and take seriously that actually children have been organized quite seriously, and that children have been actually organizing in ways that do pose a threat. A threat, meaning in a good way, to the regimes of militarization, securitization, repressive regimes in the region and on the global order. Children leading protests in Gaza and in Bethlehem were, over the last 2 years, constantly the direct targets of repressive, incredibly violent forms of repression long before the attack on Gaza. Children are the primary actors in leading these protests. And I don't mean children meaning 19-year-olds. I mean children meaning 9 and 10, 11, 12-year-olds. We know that the Syrian uprisings of 2011 were started by children who were writing graffiti and rising up against the police in Syria. We've forgotten them now that we're talking about jihadis and ISIS and the Kurds. But the original uprising was led not by children working as proxies for others, but by children. So why this is constantly, again, even in my own work in Brazil and Egypt, it's constantly been like, oh yeah, well there's children protesting and mobilizing around my building and around my life, and not always, and in very unruly ways, which of course aren't ideologically streamlined or packaged, but that I didn't read in consistent ways, and so forced to by these patterns, these monstrous political representations of children that just could not be ignored this year. So I want in this new project to look at the continuation, but also diverging a bit from my last project on militarized humanitarian war as a way of life in global order, to look particularly at children as illegible workers, as illegible authors of new forms of sociality, and why that the sexualization of any child who speaks as a worker or as an author of public sociability becomes sexually criminalized, and why any academic, which often happens to be queer academics, who take very seriously the way children author their own lives as workers and as authors of alternative forms of sociability and resistance, why they're often sexually criminalized as sex predators when they do so. I'm going to talk about this when I finally get to Egypt now. Okay, so in Egypt, we've had, in the last year, a cycle of, now that I've reached the introduction to my paper, I have 5 more minutes. Okay, so let me just point to a couple really important moments here. In June 2014, we had 2 interesting articles appear which represented these 2 clashing paradigms of thinking about children and politics. We had Juan Cole's editorial in the New York Times, I believe it was, in which he talked about there's still hope for the tech-savvy Facebook generation of the Arab youth, that maybe implying that somehow getting rid of the brotherhood in Egypt allows them a second chance, or maybe not. It's a little bit blurry, but basically like we need to return to this positive discourse of the potential of the Arab, liberal, tech-savvy Arab youth to still have a future in the Middle East. At the same time, in the same week, an editorial appeared in Masri al-Yom, a supposedly progressive Egyptian newspaper, authored by a professor of moral philosophy at Zagazig University, arguing that what Egypt needs is the Brazilian solution to its social problems, to unleash its economic growth. And the Brazilian solution was, of course, to exterminate all street children in Egypt. That was what was holding back the country. Now, this, of course, dates as long as a 20-year discussion about Brazil as a model and counter-model for Egypt dealing with its security problems in the streets. Brazil, since before the times of the Candelaria massacre, when there was a massacre of street children in downtown Rio de Janeiro, which Egypt at that point was, all its newspapers talked about that massacre and offered an Egyptian solution as the opposite to the Brazil solution, which was, at that time, very radical, which was to give children their own choices, to give loose children or street children their own choices to come and go from centers of education and job creation and empowerment, to not register under, to not have to use their own IDs or register under their family names, in order to basically completely demilitarize pro-citizenship, autonomy-based, agency-based notions of how to deal with the problem of street children in Egypt. That was the Egyptian solution versus the Brazilian solution, as we talked about then. Now we've gone full circle, and after a couple of years in which children led massive sets of protests in Egypt on their own in separate spaces that were not Tahrir, children took over their own primary schools, kicked out their teachers during 2011 and 12, taught their own classes. These are primary schools. Children, of course, involved in labor unrest. Children meaning to the age of 12. Because above the age, from 12 to 16, you're actually legally allowed to work. So children below the age of 12 make up something like 10 to 15% of the industrial and manufacturing labor class in Egypt. If you include people up to 18, that can jump up to 50% of the actual people doing hard jobs in Egypt. Now, this is not unusual We know that children in the United States work harder than anybody to accumulate cultural capital, doing constant classes, constant chess teams, constant soccer matches, constantly memorizing. Even their video games are educational. So children laboring is the norm. They labor more than probably adults do in all contexts. But in terms of the dirty work, yes, children are up to 50% of the laboring class. So why shouldn't they have grievances that they express by taking over their spaces, by taking over their streets, by the fact that children are mostly the delivery boys and girls, the shop boys and girls, bringing supplies back and forth, completing the supply chains from Chinese salespeople to manufacturers to delivery people. These are children that are doing these jobs. So they know the streets, they know the connections, they know how the economies link together. So when they take over streets, why do we, even social scientists, just think, oh, this is a crazy nuisance, what's going on here? Or is this, they're not legible as social movements. But in Egypt in 2012 and 13, they became insistently legible as social movements as they joined forces with the ultras, soccer fan clubs, which explicitly attacked the police state, burned down police stations and security stations, surrounded military checkpoints, stopped entire highways from circulating, not Tahrir Square, but highways, metro stations, shopping malls, things that remind me a lot of some of the children and adolescent movements in Brazil that take over shopping malls, or the Astões and the beaches and zones like that. Egyptian children were doing things like that as well. So what I talk about in the longer paper is the way that those advocates for the children themselves and the iconographies they use, such as SpongeBob, whereas the youth of 20 and 30-year-olds use V for Vendetta as their kind of icon. As children use SpongeBob, and this kind of use of SpongeBob and the fatwas and the Salafist mobilizations against SpongeBob as gay, and the children are... But then you have this constant placement of, if you see on the upper right, it's kind of like military love, like this kind of I'm in love with the military, and then SpongeBob is like, yeah, right, fuck you. And then, SpongeBob is voting for the Egyptian constitution. This is in Rabaa al-Adawiya. This is in the occupation of the Muslim Brotherhood in that square. Even the Muslim Brotherhood, when they wanted to keep their children happy and entertained during this long occupation, they brought the two queerest, most anarchic figures, Barney and SpongeBob, to sing and dance during the Muslim Brotherhood rallies. This is in Rabaa al-Adawiya 2 days before the massacre that killed them all. So, this is the current political system in Egypt as it's been mapped by the current social movement coalition. So these are real protagonists, and this is a horribly blurry presentation, but they have real economic grievances. They have been leaders in particular tactical interventions that have occupied streets and occupied schools and occupied police stations, but they're constantly looked at, even by many of the activists themselves, as a kind of aberration, as a perversion, as an embarrassment, not taken seriously on their own terms as activists. And of course, constantly I challenge myself, we challenge ourselves, why we're so self-conscious. There must be something perverse in me that is making you romanticize the child and take them seriously. Because we're constantly being acted. The books that have been written about street children in Egypt that develop this Egyptian model, that's a model of empowerment versus the Brazilian model of extermination, as it's understood in Egypt. Those people have, every single one of them has been put in jail. The man Kamal Fahmy, who had his NGO closed, and he was arrested as a sex predator. Recently, just this year, a woman who has also had an empowerment organization for children was arrested as a terrorist for training children to be soldiers to overthrow the Sisi government. These are big paintings of murals of martyred children that have died during protests. All right, so I got to finish. So there you go. So during the inauguration of Sisi, you had another kind of right-wing children's movement, children marching with boots of the military strapped to their head, saying, yes, we want the dictator, we want military power to return to Egypt. So children's movements are not univocal. Resistance amongst children is not contained within our apparatus of progress, right? They are unruly, and they can spill from right to left. But I think the lesson that I want to argue for is that we need to take seriously the particular spaces and temporalities of children's movement and try to allow new forms of legibility to arise in which we get beyond the focus on a particular youth and archaic form of agency and see the structural, social, and cultural conditions that can allow for children's movements and their radicalism to be appreciated and for us to find solidarity with them. Thank you very much.
We'll now have Zakia Salim from Rutgers University, who will work to set up the technology here and will then speak on new feminism as personal revolutions, micro-rebellious bodies.